Okay, hello. I'm Scott Stephenson. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution. I am so excited by the conversation we're going to have today with two good friends, people who really make me feel like an underachiever. Uh, Paul Oakley Stovall, a poet, a producer, a playwright, an actor. We're going to get deep into your story here, Paul. Also, currently on pause as George Washington with the Hamilton musical touring the country. And my dear friend, Dr. Joanne Freeman, professor of history at Yale University, who I've known since we were graduate students and has lit up the world with her incredible work for many decades now on Alexander Hamilton, on the early Republic, on the world of the story of Alexander Hamilton. Of course, we're having this conversation on the eve of the world premiere on television, on cable, of the musical that was recorded and will be soon available. I think July 3rd that will be playing. And our original thought, of course, was to kind of record a little bit of a pregame kind of program here. And we'd actually set in motion this conversation, and then a series of events erupted around the nation that we're gonna get into a little bit later here. That's a reminder that history has its eyes on us, and I'm really excited for where we're going to go today. So I want to just briefly say a few more words about my two guests today. Then we'll talk a little bit about the musical, about Paul and Joanne's connections, have a little discussion back and forth, and then we definitely are going to want to sort of land on reflecting a little bit on the significance of this particular moment in American and world history, and the connections between the past, our present, and hopefully shaping a future that we all will feel good about. So, Paul, let me start with you. Just kind of dig into a little bio here.
Okay.
It's you are from Chicago originally, is that correct?
That is correct. I'm from Chicago. My parents are, my extended family is from Arkansas, about an hour south of Little Rock. And my parents were part of the migration north. My father got a job in Chicago, and my mom soon followed. And so I was born in Chicago, but with Southern sensibility.
Uh-huh.
Let's say that. My brother, actually, who's 5 years older, he never lost his Southern sensibility. I was more of a city kid, and the second child, they just let you
raise yourself.
Yeah. So that's my cultural, geographical mix growing up, and I've always had a love of the arts. I was one of those kids who it was in every club and every thing you could think of going through school, and I finally settled on the arts because I think the arts are a great mix of all things. Mathematics, history, you get a bit of everything as you travel through these different roles and these different scenarios.
Yeah, I know. Did you start with poetry? Was that sort of your gateway into all of this?
Well, yeah, not by. I think it found me. I was in one of those schools where we were not the top funded school, so they would bring in specialists to have different programs. And there was a gentleman named Mort Castle who came to have a poetry semester. And some of us were chosen who were pretty good at English to get this after school special class. And I ended up writing a book of poetry that he saw and said, we need to publish this. So I was published by Trail Press at age 16.
One of the things I know
to everyone's surprise.
One of the things I know about you, Paul, also is that you're not, it's not a linear path to where you are right now.
Not at all. I fell into acting as a career. I studied it in college, and then worked as a Chicago actor for many years. And then moved to New York with a show I did in Chicago that I thought was going to launch my Broadway career. I was going to be a big star on Broadway. That did not happen at all. Fell into the sort of downtown indie arts crowd that doesn't pay your rent. And a friend of mine said, hey, there's an opportunity to volunteer for this political event with this guy, Senator Obama. And I was like, oh yeah, that guy. He's not gonna win, but sure, yeah, I'll do it. I mean, you know, this was at that April 2008 period or April 2007, no, April 2008, where people thought, good guy, it's nice to have a Black candidate. Hillary's gonna be, you know, so I was there too. And I got swept up, and Mrs. Obama saw me at that volunteer event, and they needed more people. His popularity was growing faster than he could staff up, and they didn't have that legacy kind of thing where there were just all these people waiting to be on the team. So I got pulled in with, I don't want to say zero qualifications, because I think acting prepares you for a lot of things in life. But those specific qualifications I didn't have, but they needed warm bodies. And I spent the next 7 years working for them, traveling not just the country, but the world once they got into office. And then in the last year, everyone was kind of going their own way in the 8th year because you had to find a new job. And I got picked up on Bernie Sanders' campaign, did that for a year, and somehow fell back into theater. I don't know. And of all things, you know, I had kind of decided that I was done with acting, and of all things, I fell into this show. So if you're gonna fall back into theater, go big.
So in my dream scenario, if I was going to write this story, I would want you to have been present when President Obama laughed when he first heard Lin-Manuel Miranda, you know, pitching like, yeah, I'm writing this hip hop musical about Alexander Hamilton.
I mean, the only thing I remember about that was actually Mrs. Obama's clip where she went, good luck with that. And even I thought that. I caught it as kind of a YouTube clip. I didn't know Lin, his work, or, you know, I actually almost did a workshop of In the Heights before it got produced at the O'Neill National Music Theater Conference, where they used sort of the same stable of actors, and they were trying to just throw us in to help Tommy and Lin get it going. I didn't end up doing that, but that was kind of the only, I'd heard of him, and you know, but I was determined to not go back into theater, you see. So I was not keeping up. And then when Hamilton came out, one of my former staff mates with the Obama said, hey, have you heard about this thing? It's about Alexander Hamilton and the presidents, and it's interesting. I heard it's going to be really good. And I just thought to myself, great, I'll never be a part of that. Good, I'm happy for him, good.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, it was great. You know, we of course met when you were performing here in Philadelphia last year. And it was one of these really bizarre situations where at the last minute, I got a call from a member of our corporate advisory council, Jim Dever from Bank of America, who they were doing a small event. They had some tickets, and he said, you know, asked if my wife and I were free. And so we said, sure, you know, great. So we went, and we were sitting kind of in the middle, you know, of the seats. And I looked down, and I see my two friends, Dean Melissa, who has been for, I think, probably 20 years now, George Washington at Mount Vernon. He's, you know, everyone recognizes Dean, and has just an unbelievable command of and presence as Washington. And then Ian Kahn, who was the actor who played George Washington in the television series Turn. So I see him down there. So I texted Dean. I said, hey, look over your left shoulder. And we waved, and he texted me back and said, hey, stick around after the show. We're going to go meet Paul Stovall, who plays Washington in the show. So I thought, oh my gosh, 3 George Washingtons. This is going to be incredible. So we had a chance to say hi afterwards. And I remember asking if you'd been to see the museum yet, and you said, oh no, I really want to go. And so it was great to be able to, you know, take you to see George Washington's tent and spend a good long time.
That was a great night. That was a great night. The trifecta of George Washington's from 3 different mediums as well.
Exactly.
So we all had different takes on it. You know, Dean has to be he has to inhabit and be in the moment, and where he might have certain things memorized, with different people visiting and having different questions or saying different things, he has to be able to pivot. And so he has to know Washington in a way where after we left you, we went for a drink, and the stories that he can tell and the way he inhabits it.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas I have to be consistent and not by rote, but I have to be consistent because there are other people around me, and there's a soundtrack out there. People know what to expect, and you have to stay alive but consistent. And it's more like an athlete situation with me. And Ian, of course, who, remember how surprised he was to feel short?
Yeah, that's right.
You know, he's the TV George Washington, so he's not really. Everyone around him was probably 5'5", so he probably felt really tall at 5'11". And his journey with George Washington was more like, I only get this one chance, because once it's shot, it's done. So the fight that he was having and I don't mean fight in a bad way, but his battle to, you know, where is my position in this scene? Shouldn't I be here in this scene? You know, if you're inside the tent, wouldn't I be, you know, so he was a deep researcher and really knew, he almost knew more than anyone else around him, because he knew how important it was. In TV, you just get the one chance.
Yes. Well, Joanne, I want to introduce you a little more deeply as well.
I'm such a fan.
Oh, yeah, you and me both. You know, again, I said earlier, I feel like such an underachiever around both of you. And that feeling about Joanne, it goes back decades, actually, 30-some years, when we were in graduate school together at the University of Virginia, and already working on dueling, and more than a passing interest in Alexander Hamilton and honor. You know, you were working on the dissertation that became Affairs of Honor. You know, just such an inspiration to me in terms of your scholarship, but also your commitment to being a public historian, a public intellectual. You write op-ed pieces, you blog, you podcast. You know, is life interesting for you right now, Joanne? You love how it's all turned out.
Well, this is a quirky moment to say I love how it's all turned out. I will say that I could not have ever imagined my life course. You know, I was reading, I wasn't reading history, I was reading letters, Hamilton's letters and then other people's letters, before I knew that historian was a job, before I knew anyone who was really a professor of history. That I'm not one of those families, you know, I don't come from one of those families where your parents are professors and you kind of, like, I know that life, nothing. So I was just reading these letters from the time period, and they fascinated me because I had been reading biographies because of the bicentennial. And some of them frustrated me because they forced me to hear what other people had to say. And I wanted to know what those people had read that gave them the right to say this. I was like, I don't know, 14 years old. And I went to the library with a biography that particularly frustrated me about Hamilton. And I said, what did he read that led him to make these conclusions that I don't particularly like? I wish I could remember what in my 14-year-old brain didn't like it, I don't know. But she sent me off to Hamilton's, the 27 volumes of Hamilton's papers, his, you know, all his letters, all his writings. And I started reading and I never stopped, because that to me was the real stuff, right? That was history. No one was going to tell me what it meant. I was free to kind of float through it and look for patterns and try to understand things. And at the time, hard as it is to believe, no one really knew or cared about Alexander Hamilton. So it was, you know, it was kind of my little thing that I was studying, you know, in the library. There are all these Jefferson biographies and Washington and John Adams, and there weren't that many Hamiltons. So it kind of felt like my little personal quest. And that, you know, drew me into asking bigger questions. And as you suggested, Scott, I got interested in dueling, and then I got interested in honor culture, and then I got interested in politics and political culture and the sort of weirdness of it in this time period and how it made sense to people at that moment. And but you know, it was very late in the game. I mean, I was 30 when I started grad school, and I had done a number of other careers before that point. And part of what drew me in was I was doing public history without knowing it. And so I got drawn into teaching because in grad school, I discovered how much I love it. And so then in a sense, I came in a backward kind of a way. It was like, I'm going to do public history. Oh yeah, wow, I love teaching in the university environment. So that's kind of how both things ended up being combined.
Now, how did you, I know there's a kind of, there's a song in the musical that's sort of an homage to some of your scholarship, the 10 Dual Commandments, right?
Indeed.
How did you get,
I didn't know this.
get connected? Yeah, because you obviously got connected to Lynn along the way somewhere.
I did, although he read that book, Affairs of Honor, which was my dissertation. He found that on his own and read it on his own. And so when I went to see the play, and for the first time with another friend who's a historian, and that moment in the play comes along, and I lean over to my friend and I'm like, it's a dueling song. Like, this is excellent, it's a dueling song. And then they start singing and I'm like, it's a rules of dueling song, right? That's the stuff I write about and love. And then there's a lyric in that song from a document that I found at the New York Historical Society. And when that lyric came out, I said to my friend, that's my document. That's my chapter. And when I talked to Lynn, when I next talked to him, which was might have been after that show, or I saw it again at some point very early on, I spoke with him and I brought him a copy of Affairs of Honor to give to him, and I'd signed it, you know, and I handed it to him and he said, well, I already have that. I said, you do? Is that song based on my book? And he was like, yeah, of course. So then it was like, okay, and this was at the Public Theater, and it had not, you know, gone on to become what it has become. But even so, the sort of surreal nature of sitting in the audience and realizing that, like, I remember reading that document, you know, and I should say for the people watching, the lyric is about the doctor turning his back so he can have deniability. I found at the New York Historical Society, Aaron Burr's second went to trial for his involvement in the duel, and he took notes of the case. And the doctor testified at the trial and described how his back was to the dueling ground. And when the lawyer said to him, well, what did you see? And he says, I didn't see anything. I think I heard gunshots. So, you know, the document, the notes from the trial had all of this amazing information. You know, the dueling pistols were in a bag. So when the doctor is asked, and the boatmen who rowed them across are asked, what did you see? They're like, well, we saw a bag. Like, we don't know what was in the bag. You know, so all of these things that protected duelists because it was illegal. That was what I was looking for, was to understand how it actually worked, but it ended up in the play. So although I should say, I had met kind of along the lines of what Paul was saying, when I first heard that there was some crazy person writing first music in a musical about Alexander Hamilton. Right, by this point, I'd been studying him for decades. And I thought, okay, I don't know, like, this can't work, right? This is insane. However, there won't be 2 musicals about Alexander Hamilton in my lifetime. So I got to find this guy, and I have to give him some of Hamilton's letters so he could put Hamilton's real words in the show. That was my quest. And that was how I met him, was my wanting to give him one of the collections of Hamilton's letters that I had edited, because I wanted, if there's going to be this weird moment, Hamilton's own words have to go in the show. And there are a lot of actual quotes from Hamilton letters in the show, which made my historian heart happy.
Oh, incredible. And not only all of that, but you've actually fired a dueling pistol in Weehawken. Is that correct?
Not in Weehawken, but I have
Okay.
fired a dueling pistol. Yeah, well, you know, I wanted to experience some of the things I was writing about, you know, and I write about politics and political culture, and I write about violence, you know, early American politics and violence. So first I went into gentleman training. So I took horse riding lessons, I took fencing lessons. I learned that I would have died 1,000 times. Like, I was bad at all of it. I was bad at bad at riding a horse. And then I wanted to shoot a dueling pistol. So a good friend of mine had a friend on a Connecticut police force who managed to get us onto the a firing range with a black powder dually pistol. And the three of us sat there and shot this to see what it was like. And I learned a lot about the inaccuracies, although that was more from watching other people who knew what they were doing fire the dueling pistol. But there's and I'm sure Paul would sort of have much to say on this subject too. There's something about the smell and the feel and the heft and the reality of pulling the trigger and having that moment happen, that even though, there's nothing I have in common with anything that happened in the past other than that sensory moment, but that kind of evidence matters, right? That kind of reality of that moment of shooting a dueling pistol. I can't say, on page 59 of my book, it's reflected there, but it shapes how you understand the past.
You're talking like an actor, which I love. You really are. I'm sitting here listening to you going, researching, trying to put yourself in the position so that what you do write about it has as much blood in it, so to speak, as possible. So our choreographer, Andy Blankenbuehler, who I didn't know before I started the show, he came to give some notes, and I wasn't even sure who he was, to be frank, because I had never met him before, but here's this man giving us a lot of very intricate notes about, you're not just walking across here, you're in the town, and at this part in the city, no one knows who's a traitor and who's a patriot. So don't just walk across the stage. What are you coming in with and what are you leaving with? He said to me, when George Washington comes in, when Charles Lee is shot down during that, right after Tendo Command, he says, you're not just standing in the wings, you had left and someone told you there's a problem back here, and you're riding your horse at full speed and then jumping off the horse and walking in, and that just happens to be when the audience sees you. Mm-hmm. So for a while, I'd be off stage like this, kind of.
Really?
I'll admit that.
I love that.
It was just my way of remembering. And like you said, the whole point of it isn't that you get it 100% right or that the audience can tell, oh, I think he was riding a horse just before he came on. That's not the point. The point is that you are in some way trying to summon up either the specific spirit of George Washington or Hamilton in your case, but that you're just trying to summon up all of the factors that go into what their life was back then. And so that what you do can be more accurate. And you
in a sensory way, you put yourself in that moment, right? So you're whatever you're doing backstage, you're now in that moment in a different, in all of my writing, anyone who looks at my first book, every chapter begins with a person and an emotion. Thomas Jefferson was angry. Hamilton was a man tormented. And the reason I do that is because that's where you have to be when you start the chapter. You have to be in the moment and have the emotion and sort of walk into the weird behavior. So this is really fascinating.
You're a director too. I want you to direct me in something. This is great.
But I want to ask you a question, Paul.
Okay.
So, you discovered that you're going to be doing this role. What did you do to prepare yourself for the role? What did you read or did you research or
that's a great question. By the time I got the role, Hamilton was a phenomenon, and everybody knew that having a job in Hamilton was in American theater and maybe in global theater was the job to have. So my first thing was panic and abject terror. Of course, and I thought, oh, they're not as good at their jobs as people think because they hired me. So let me get my name on the contract and try to stay in it as long as I can until they discover that I don't know what I'm doing. So what I did was I fell upon everything I had learned in Chicago theater, which, to just brag about Chicago theater, we just focus on the work. We're mostly nonprofit. So you get like 3 weeks of rehearsal, you run the show for 2 weeks, and then you're on to the next. Wow. So there isn't a sense of holding on. There's a sense of quick research, make the connection with your scene partner, and figure it out from there. And so I went into Hamilton thinking that would sustain me, but I was replacing someone. So I didn't get 3 weeks of rehearsal. In fact, my rehearsal was to an empty space until you get a put in, and then you're suddenly with the entire cast. So my journey was call upon all your skills to survive And oddly, what I didn't know I was doing was inhabiting George Washington in that way, finding every skill I had to just get up there every night until you could get in the boots on, you know, in your own personal way. And it was funny. I felt it crossing over at a certain point where I was like, wow, everything I'm doing is kind of what they were doing in the revolution. Nobody knew what was happening. Everyone just had to hold on tight and use your faculties and survive. Just keep your wits about you. Then I fell into research. As Patrick Vassell, our supervising director, he travels around to the tours and keeps upkeep on the show. As he said to me, hey, so what research are you doing? And I told him I'd started to do a few things. And he just went, careful, the rabbit hole goes really, really deep.
Scott and I know about that.
Clear words were never spoken.
Well, yeah, I mean, Scott, I will transition to you because as I keep falling into that rabbit hole, and I'm very fortunate, I think, to be on the tour because I go from city to city, and our tour is sort of on the Eastern Seaboard. We've ventured out west as far as Pittsburgh or Louisville, and even Pittsburgh. I thought, oh, okay, one city where I can just do the show. You know, this city wasn't even, you know, he wasn't here. Sure enough, when he was 21, there's a whole monument to his adventures out there, and he really was a cat with 9 lives. And if things had gone one little bit different in that area, it was before it was called Pittsburgh, but so we never, you know, it would have been our first president, President Lee, perhaps, President Charles Lee, who knows?
Right.
So with what, you know, boy, so then that spun me out. So Scott, I'm very curious about this. You have a passion for something that you will never be able to touch for real. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Real is real for whoever it's real to, right? If you're feeling it, it's real. But you'll never be able to meet Hamilton or meet Washington or meet them. There are paintings, there's not even photos, there's paintings. To know what they actually look like. How is that simultaneously frustrating and something that, of course, keeps you going? Because there's always more to find, right?
No, it is. What a great question. Thank you, Paul, because it's a daily struggle.
Really?
It's interesting. I've talked to historians, you know, who've written these incredible books. You know, one of my good friends and mentors, you know, Fred Anderson, Joanne, you know, Fred, you know, wrote this incredible 800-page book, I think it was, on the subject of my dissertation, which was the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And Fred wrote that, and it's so evocative, and had never visited any of the places. Like, he could go on that journey, wow, you know, through the written word. And I think it's just an intellectual failing of mine that I need to taste it and touch it, and, you know, more tactile. Maybe they sometimes call us visual learners. So in looking back, I've always been drawn to, like, when I was in high school, I volunteered in Pittsburgh, my hometown, as a costumed living history demonstrator down at Fort Pitt Museum. So that was my young George Washington introduction. You know, I worked as an archaeologist at Monticello when I was at UVA as a, you know, graduate student. And why I'm the guy who pinches himself every morning looking in the mirror, having been the 3rd employee of this Museum of the American Revolution, where, you know, we struggled as we sat down, and Phil Mead, who was our chief historian, who was kind of the Rogers to my Hammerstein in terms of putting the experience together. You know, how do you make these people come alive when you've got sort of John Trumbull paintings? And, you know, I always like to say that song that didn't make it into the final cut of the musical, No John Trumbull, I've always felt like this is actually an advertisement for the Museum of the American Revolution, because we sort of set out to make it, you know, the phrase I used was a movie you can walk through. You know, it's told through personal stories, it's tactile. You know, you try to evoke a sense of place, and all importantly, contingency and uncertainty. And just as you were saying, both of you were just saying, you know, that they didn't know how it was going to turn out. And so, you know, it's been great. We've had nearly 1 million people through the museum in the last 3 years. Of course, wow, currently shut down. But man, the response is, you know.
Let me ask you this, Scott, because as you talked about that, I remembered when you took me through the museum, and it crossed my mind, like, where there are holes, because you can only work with, in your field, you can only work with what you find, right? I remember there were some bowls right after the King George, that next room you go into, and just this bowl, you're able to tell a whole other story that you may not have had the actual details for, but knowing that if that was found on that ship, that must have come from here. So how do you decide, like, all right, that's a hole and we should just leave it as a hole because we just don't know? Or on what level can we put this thread across to here confidently? How do you do that while you say, and we'll continue to search for the truth, but we need to, we feel like we know enough to put something here? How do you do that?
So one of the great sort of, I'd say, like, watershed moments for me professionally was actually picking up a book that I think is one of the most important textbooks for making museums or doing public history that isn't written by a historian or a museum person. It's actually written by film director John Sayles, of course, the legendary, you know, and he did a movie, I guess it was back in the early 80s, called Matewan, which is about the, you know, the coal strikes. I mean, fabulous. So he wrote a book called Thinking in Pictures, which is about the making of the movie Matewan. And essentially it's just like, here's how you make a film. And me realizing, actually I assigned it when I used to teach a public history course, that getting curators, future curators, historians thinking about, when you're writing a monograph, you can take 40 pages, to set a scene, and you're assuming most of your readers are going to read the whole thing, right? And so you can lay out an argument. But the challenge we have is more like Peter Jackson's got to turn the Lord of the Rings into films, right? So there's whole storylines that disappear. You can convey the kind of emotional story. You can convey a lot of, but you have to make decisions. And so if you embrace that, so you can kind of write around the holes. And we started early on in the process, like the marketing people like to talk about, well, this is a museum that will tell the complete story of the American Revolution. Well, that's absurd. So we started saying, we're telling a story of the American Revolution. So a character or a community might pop up at a certain time, and they sort of carry the story forward, and then they kind of hand it on to someone else. And, you're not getting the complete story of anything really, but you've been taken on this journey that's really, the goal is to expand your notion of this founding era, of who the founders of this nation were.
And the person experiencing it can go off on a tangent when they see something that pulls them or that they connect to personally. So all three of our jobs are not dissimilar. You got to make decisions. You have to go forward in faith, and
you have to create. I'm going to use two words that don't exist. You have to create a sense of placeness, right? If all of us do, and particularly in your case, Scott, but still for all of us, a sense of thingness, of the reality of things in some way, and all of the qualifications that you can make about how we don't know exactly, we can't tell full stories, we can't tell all the stories, we don't know everything that happened, we don't know for sure what happened at all. All of the qualifications aside, we can get at aspects of the past in a way that's grounded on evidence, paper evidence, thing evidence. And in a museum, if you walk through and you create for your visitor a kind of, ethos of moment, so that, as you were just saying, Paul, the visitor can kind of, you notice the bowls, right? A visitor can kind of pick on what appeals to them and then construct for themselves the story that takes them through, right? That's what a museum does in a sense. You'll speak to this better than I, but Paul, whatever you're showing up on that stage, you're also trying to evoke in people a response to what you're doing, right? And the same thing in what a historian, there are all kinds of historians and not all of them are aiming at the public, but still, it's the same thing, which is to capture, to create a kind of aha moment on paper that people are like, oh, okay, I just grabbed a hold of something I didn't have before.
Mm-hmm. And it's why at the Hamel, what was it called? The Hamilton,
Hamilton.
the Hamilton, not the Ham exhibition. You know, the big thing they put in Chicago.
Yeah.
I was the main curator for that.
That's why I got separated from my group 3 times. This is, this is when you know a museum is working, because they're trying to shuffle you along because the next group has paid for their slot. And I was always having some museum worker come up to me and go, Mister, your group went. And then I missed the Yorktown, because you know that part was timed, so I had to wait. I was behind my group again because I was not going to miss that. But I got caught up in the ballroom.
Right. So
just before, and my mind went. I didn't even see the people I was with anymore because it took me to this other place.
And I should correct myself. I was the historical consultant and not the curator. However, for those who don't know about it, there was this massive exhibits/experience through the world of the play. And the point of it was in different rooms for you to feel something, connect something in a personal or physical kind of a way. That would lead you to think differently. And then of course there were objects and there were panels on the walls and there was the stuff of history, but like there was a moment in the creation of it. David Korins, who was that, right, he's amazing, was the, designed the sets and the stage for Hamilton itself and was the source and master of this project as well. There was a moment we were working for weeks to try and figure out how to talk about Hamilton's financial plan in an exhibit in a way that the public would want to be interested in. We had like blueprints and we were writing on whiteboards and week after week after week. And finally, in frustration, I said, and not frustrated with them, but just the fact that I couldn't figure it out either. I said, here's the most important thing to realize. No one knew if Hamilton's plan would work. Even Hamilton didn't know that his plan would work. And David paused for a moment. And then he said, okay, so when people walk into the section on the Treasury plan, the ground will shift and be uneven and people will be thrown off balance. Mm-hmm. And I remember it was like, ugh. It was like,
that'll work.
No, like it just didn't, to physically set yourself up for that feeling in 1,000 years wouldn't have occurred to me. And that's more of the same of what we're talking about.
Right.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. You might recall, both of you, in the kind of middle section of the exhibits here at the museum, which is kind of 1776 to Valley Forge. It gets very narrow, and there's all these twists and turns. And one of our reviewers, actually, I love when the reviewer tells you what you were thinking but have never said out loud. He said that it made physical the length and the uncertainty of the War of Independence, in a way that no words on a wall could do it, and that's what you can do on stage, that's what you can do through your writing and these experiences that we create, so it's not, the past is gone forever, we won't ever truly live it, but I do believe you can kind of feel it in a way that is so important if you're going to engage with the ideas that are obviously the most important thing to us.
And here's the thing that I think your museum does, and that I think the play does too, and it particularly captured it towards the end of the exhibit when you have the photographs of people from the Revolutionary period, right? So most people will have not ever seen photographs, but just the fact that they exist, right? Most people are like, ugh. Like these are people who fought in the Revolution or from the Revolutionary era. So that, even most of my work has been in the 1790s and there are no photographs. So even as the historian, when I went into that space, it makes it so real, right? It gives it a human form in a way that kind of slaps you in the face and makes you pause. Right. And that's one of the things that the play does. Right? I mean, the play is musical theater, so it's not, a work of history, but one of the magical things that it does as theater and as musical theater, and that you do in acting as George Washington, is to bring people to life that no one saw as being alive ever in their understanding of history, the United States. You know, history, I think, is this boring collection of dates, and what the museum does and what the play does, and hopefully what my writing does, and speaking does, is reveal to people and drive home the fact that these are real people making choices. And some of those choices were good, some of those choices were bad, and you can't understand the past and you can't understand the present without understanding the humanness of the past and all of the contingency of that moment.
Yeah. We're all doing the same thing.
Who knew?
Who knew? We had never spoken about it before, so now we kind of figured it out.
I know. It's really interesting.
Oh, yeah. You know, Paul, I know you've reflected on I think in some of your, one of your interviews, I saw you talked about, thought it was a lovely observation about the theatricality of the musical. And I think you made the observation that you felt like this must have been what it would have been like to experience Shakespeare, for instance, you know, which of course was a way that a long ago generation learned about English history, right?
Well, more specifically, even if I'm remembering right, I think that the interviewer was asking me about the language of Hamilton, and if they weren't, I took it there. And I specifically was talking about how the groundlings experience Shakespeare and how I equated that with how young people hear Hamilton. It's not like he's using words we've never heard, but it's the way in which he's using words and the way that he's making the audience sit forward, and how thrilling it is for the young people who are like, I understand the way that I don't have to hear it 3 times. I know exactly. They can even add more into it because they know even the references he's making to different rap artists in different parts of the show. And I just think that's so smart, so thrilling that words have not just power. Words, I use this term a lot, words have blood in them and they awaken you. And yeah, that's why the show never gets boring for me either, because when people say, oh, you do the same thing every night, I don't do the same thing every night, because there's different energy coming from the audience. Oldest acting adage in the world is there is no show until the audience is there, because they're the last character. And what makes it improv, or not completely improv, but what makes it in the moment is you don't know how that audience is going to react.
Yeah, I'd love to hear, Paul, when because of course I've only been in the audience and I've seen you perform, and I just, what's that awareness like, or how are you? I always imagine, you know, the lights are in your eyes and you know there's people out there, but how do you sort of feel their presence?
In a moment-to-moment visceral sense, in a technical way, there's 2 ways you feel them. In a technical sense, if there's something funny happening, now in a show like Hamilton, you can't hold, because that's a train that's moving, and once that train gets going, Hamilton is an opera. It's actually an opera, you know, so it goes. But generally, you feel an audience through their laughter or responses, and don't let them take over the show, but in order for them to hear every word, you have to, it's a skill to learn how to ride laughter and then come over it so they can take in the next moment, but don't rob them of their joy if they're laughing together or they're crying together. Now, that placeness, thingness, unexplainable alchemy thing is the other way you experience them. Just the feeling you have of however many sets of eyes are all in one place. They say that, and they've done studies where an audience's heart beats all the same. At some point in a show, everyone's heart is beating at the same rhythm and the same time. So you're all becoming one, and you're just people in a box. You're all just in a box together. That's all that's happening, you know? So there's that alchemical, you just have to spiritually submit and bow down to what a beautiful thing it is that we're not interpreting it the same way, but we're all hearing the same thing. And in some ways, I let myself be included with them. When I look at my other actors on stage, I'm experiencing their performance. I'm enjoying it. I'm saying, ooh, Edric did something new tonight. Oh, that's interesting. I may not even be in the scene with him. This is our Hamilton. Or he's doing something different in the scene with me and I'm responding to it in the moment. And so there's that side of it too. that
and
keeps it alive.
you know, it's one of my passions is going to the theater, and I mean, I particularly love musical theater, but I just love theater. But one of the things that I love about it is that very thing, right? Is that it doesn't exist without all of those people in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And there's such a power to everybody experiencing it at that moment for the first time, right? And so I would assume you feel this, that no two nights are the same, because the audience is different. Like you said, people do different things on the stage, and as minor as that sounds, I've seen some plays more than once, and I've had a very different experience each time, and it depends on the night and how people are on the stage and what kinds of people are in the audience, and
what you brought into the theater with you that night. Were you late? How was your day at work that day?
Where are you looking on the stage, right? Like,
where were you sitting? Right.
Exactly. Who are you sitting with? You know, all things. Yeah, it's hard to describe that power. You know, it's unlike anything else. It's even, I mean, I think good writing of all kinds can transform you in some way. I think museums do that well, but I think there's a communal aspect of theater that has a different kind of uber power. You know, a different kind of power.
Yeah, and a show like Hamilton puts it on turbo for two reasons. One, it is sold out every night. We are on tour, the ushers, the box office people, the parking lot attendants. Every actor has to get there. Some are coming on the bicycle they rented in that town. Some are taking an Uber. Everything has to come together for us to 8 o'clock, go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And for that to happen night after night after night, it's pretty thrilling and magical, and it speaks to an intent for everyone to come together and have an experience. No matter where, I don't want to go to the show, or I can't wait to go to the show, or I don't feel like doing the show tonight, or my parents are here, I'm going to have a great night. Whatever you're coming with, everyone has an intent to experience this thing.
And I want to mention something, and then I want to hear what Scott has to say about this too. You know, historians have had a mix of responses to the play, and some of them are, you know, upset at the things that aren't in the play or at the focus of the play, and there's you know, responses to everything, and because this is so powerful, there have been extra bonus responses. Yeah. But one of the things that I think the play really does that has value, and it's related to what we've been talking about here, right, is that regardless of what is or isn't in it, it brings history to life for people who are in that room. It reminds people that it's a human process for better and worse, and there's worse involved. So it humanizes it, and it we've talked about contingency all over the place. I'll mention it again, but you know, theater drives home those major points that are important for any history, right? So to me, as a historian, I can watch the play, and I notice all of the quotes from Hamilton, and there's even a Jefferson quote in there. You know, I notice all that stuff. When I first saw it, was amazed at how much history was in the play. It's like, you know, they're singing about the Assumption of state debts, you know, singing Washington's farewell letter. Like, how is that possible? And I'm aware of what's not there, but to me, this is like, and I actually really did turn to my friend and I was like, they're singing about the Assumption of state debts. Like, how is that possible? But it's the ultimate teaching moment, right? Because you can say to people, okay, it didn't happen that way, but it's so interesting. What happened is so interesting. So come along with me and let's learn more about it. And I'm assuming that, Scott, for you as well, well, you tell me, how has the existence of the play, or has it shaped your experience and other people's experience of the museum?
Oh, you know, it's when we opened the museum in 2017, a member of the original cast, and I don't know, Paul, do you know Sidney Harcourt?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So he sang at
our. I met actually.
So he sang at our opening. You know, he worked with a group of high school performing arts high school students here. Just absolutely, you know, blew the house down. And you know, we sat the first time he saw the Washington 10 Theater. You know, was so affected by it as many are. And we actually talked about how we were almost at exactly the same moment. We were sort of cooking the museum approach up, and they were sitting around trying to work on choreography and kind of, bringing this the musical to life. And so we were having the same conversations about, well, our scholarly colleagues are going to criticize us for not engaging with this historiography or leaving out this particular piece. But as I probably hinted earlier, to me, there's like the first step upon which everything else hinges is getting people to care, which comes from this kind of feeling, this emotional connection, this empathy is the big word, for me. I'm not, as driven that our goal is better performance on the AP history exam, right? It's meeting these young people who've had this, felt this profound personal connection. I mean, I've stood in front of a signed copy of Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. This is, of course, the first published African-American poet, enslaved as a child, and with a fifth grader who had emigrated from Africa 3 years earlier and stood there as she made the connection that when she said she was born in Africa and I was born in Africa, right? Like I'm getting, it's not just my allergies, just thinking about, other, young 10-year-old girl who talked about, her response to the museum and just asking her, like, what was the moving experience here? And it was that scene of the tearing down of the statue of George III and the Declaration. And I thought she was going to go kind of Confederate monuments because that was happening. This was the fall of 2017 when we had this conversation. But what she said to me was, it made me think that 100 years from now, someone's going to go to a museum about my time. And the very next thing she was going to see, by the way, was that line of photographs and those mirrors at the end where you look at yourself and you see the words, welcome, meet the future of the American Revolution. And so I see the impact of the musical every single day. If I go down in the gallery and I'm walking past that big mural of the British ships in New York Harbor, and there's kids of a certain, age set, and I start humming 32,000 troops in New York Harbor, the heads snap.
Ding, 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 ding.
And they're like, that's really it. That's what they're singing about right there. And so it's like, it's been this, it's like the paddles that you shock a patient with. I think that's what it's done. It's given us this incredible opportunity. It's interesting, and I'd love for us to talk a little bit about sort of the musical was described as the story of America then told by America now. And though that observation meant something very different in 2015 than it means in 2020. And, I just love to spend some time hearing both of you kind of reflect on the now and, how to sort of, many people will be watching this around the time the musical will be airing, and it should be a moment of joy, for that incredible experience, and also hopefully can play a role in, getting us to reflect on the past, the present, and the future that we want to build together. So there's a ball somebody can pick up.
Joanne, do you want to take that ball?
I'll start with the ball. I think it's a fascinating moment for that, for it to be airing for any number of reasons, right? And the most superficial reason is we've all been at home forever, and now there's this wonderful moment that we're going to be able to, we're looking forward to, and it's going to be one of those moments that all kinds of people everywhere, however you get those numbers of watchers, there'll be a big audience. So it'll be a shared moment and an important moment, partly just because of where we are. But I think beyond that, it's going to be framed by a moment that's all about inclusion and exclusion, right? That's all about who's part of the story and what story are we telling, right? That's part of what we're going through now. What is the story? what parts of the story have we not seen? Who hasn't been included in the story? What kinds of stories do we need to tell now to make up for the fact that there so many aspects of it haven't been told with the amount of force and power that they should have been? That's the moment when this is going to air. So I think on the one hand, it will remind people about the fact that whatever's happening now is, obviously we don't know what's happening now or the impact of it, and that's been true forever. If people watch the play and feel that some things are not in the play that they want to be in the play, that's powerful. That's important.
Exactly.
And that starts a conversation, and that's what this moment has to be about, right? Is the conversation of what of presences and silences and inclusion and exclusion, and how do we address that? And I think the play helps create that kind of conversation.
Yeah, because ultimately, what I often say about this play, as groundbreaking and innovative as it is, I think the smart thing Lynn did was told a very traditional American musical theater story. Something that feels Western, although a lot of these stories that go, you know, we know that they go even further back. But, you know, there's the conflicted hero, there's the love interest, there's the father figure, George Washington, the Obi-Wan Kenobi, you know, there's the three traveling companions like the Wizard of Oz or Star Wars, who are, you know, one is the rough one and one is the out of control, daring one, and one is the savvy, smart one. You know, he was very canny about who he chose to show and how he chose to structure it, not to take control of it, but rather just to give us something that as groundbreaking, like, oh, those are Black people playing. Okay, so I have to, for some audience members, I have to adjust to that. And they're speaking very quickly, I have to adjust to that. So for all the things he wanted to try, he knew, I think, that at the core, I have to tell a story in a frame that will get people to open up to it, so that then they can go discover who is Ben Talmadge, who is von Steuben. They will dig, I'm gonna open this door, and then you're gonna find out, oh, actually there were lots of Schuyler children. And here's what they did. Actually, Peggy was one of the wealthiest women, you know, if you matched her wealth to today, she and her husband would still be, what, I think in the top 10 on the Forbes list. So little Peggy, who just says, and Peggy, there's more to that story. And so you can't, you know, listen, the show would be it would be Nicholas Nickleby on Turbo. It'd be twice the length of Nicholas Nickleby if he really tried to do that. But what he did instead, smartly, I think, was just tell something that deep at our core is familiar. So that, you know, when people like Joanne or even the Obamas were like, that's never gonna work. I think, you know, the reason it works is once we settle down, we go, oh, it's the friend and it's the nemesis. I know what that is. And they even told me at the beginning how it's gonna end, just in case I didn't know. So now I can just ease in and take it all in. And there are things I'm gonna miss, but he's done it in a way where it's gonna make you wanna come back, which is also pretty smart. You know, there's no way anyone who loves this show is satisfied only seeing it once.
That is true.
Yes, I threw the word satisfied in.
Okay, that's the problem, I have to say, as a person who does lectures and teaches, there are so many words in that play, and so many of them are iconic. And if you stand up and you just said the word satisfied, right? I think at some point in the last year or two, I described Hamilton as being nonstop, right? And a whole bunch of they're like, ugh! It's like, yes, you know, like, and sometimes I'll even say things and I can feel the response, and I'll say, and that was from the play, wasn't it? And they're like,
yeah, that was from the play.
But you know, there's a power and a usefulness in that, you know.
To that too, right?
Yeah.
To that cultural currency of using phrases, and whereas some are very complicated, there are some things like, I'm helpless, I'm satisfied. You go nonstop, wait for it. Some of it is stuff that hits us at a basic core of our needs as human beings. You're in love, you feel help. When you're really spinning in love, you're helpless. And the turntable starts going and Eliza's spinning. So they're all on the same page. They were all.
Well, that's musical theater, right?
That's when it really hits, when every creative is on the same page. And even though I say that, they will visit us at different times and they don't always agree. I'll get a note from one that's not antithetical, but it's incumbent upon me to say, how do I make that note from Alec Lacamoire work musically while making this note work from Blankenbuehler, because he wants me but that's for me to do. That's the alchemy of it all.
I love how complicating of the narrative it is too. There's I think most people, if they've heard of Alexander Hamilton, they might think banks,
Duel.
At the most, yeah.
At the most, etc. No one's heard about Eliza. No one's heard about the less admirable qualities, etc., etc. We're also in a moment where looking at things like monuments and who's been memorialized. I'm just curious, your reflections on the moment.
I do think these monuments have power. I do think young children who have to seeing the Confederate flag or seeing some of these statues day after day, it has power. So taking it down is important. We'll see if it's replaced with something else or if it is just left to, but I think it is better I think it's an important thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's important to note it doesn't erase history. Right? Which is what people say. You take down the statue, you've erased history. Well, no.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole conversation to be had about what it does do, but what it doesn't do is erase history, right?
Right. Yeah, it doesn't erase history. It just it doesn't direct you to believe that is the only. In fact, what it does is open up.
Well, the installation of a statue is mostly representative of the people who put the statue in that place.
That's
why
right.
They did it, right? So that's a kind of history that we never think about that actually is affected by taking it down, and we reflect who we are by taking it down. But the fact of the matter is, the people who are being commemorated in these statues, that's the history, and the history is there. And we need to think about what we're teaching, and we need to think about what we're putting in museums, and we need to think about what we're saying to the public and what they do or don't see, and that's going to happen with or without the statue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that. People say that a lot. History's being erased.
Yeah.
That's only true if the only place you get history is staring at a statue, and if the history that you're getting is only of the people who put the statue up. So it doesn't, the chemistry of that doesn't work.
That's right.
It's interesting that I've been fascinated with the history of the statue of King George in New York. And of course, if you go down to the Bowling Green, down, at the tip of Manhattan, the original fence that tried to protect the statue of the king, is now, of course, surrounds a park. And as we say in our final film here in the museum, a fence that could not protect the king from the people now contains people from around the world pursuing life, liberty, and happiness. And now, of course, the statue that we all go down and look at is of a bull on Wall Street, which is,
a girl and a little
30 yards from where the King George stood. But actually, the pedestal that statue stood on was left in 1776. After the statue was pulled down, it was broken into pieces. We, of course, recreate that very dramatically in the museum here. The pieces hauled off and melted down into musket balls, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't until, I think I'm right, say 1818, when the pedestal was actually torn down, and it makes an appearance. Very important painting, but it's not often noticed. In 1792, John Trumbull did a portrait of Washington. It was commissioned by the city of New York, and actually the original hangs in the mayor's office in New York. And Washington is standing with a horse next to him, so he's pedestrian, not equestrian. And off in the distance, you see the empty pedestal surrounded by the fence with the king gone. Pretty symbolic. And And there are newspaper articles after that pedestal was torn down of people sort of realizing, you know, we should have left that there because that reminds us of what was standing there
What's
before.
standing there.
But you know what's striking about that is almost the reverse to me. Americans, generally speaking, all the way back, are so efficient at eliminating buildings that they no longer have use for, right? So there are a lot of things, you know, the original Federal Hall, there are all kinds of things that were like, oh, we don't need it. So what's more striking to me is the fact that that stuck around for a while. It is the fact that there was a power to that people recognized, the empty pedestal that gave it more life than it might have had otherwise. I kind of love that.
Yeah.
Like an emotion and a poetry to it that probably lasted a generation, you know, when we actually spoke to children.
And there's an example of a statue being taken down and the impact and the history of that moment mattering, in that case, more than the statue being put up. So, yeah.
So Joanne, if people are interested in following you on social media, tuning into your History Matters podcast, monitoring your online course on the American Revolution at Yale, what's the best way for them to find you out there in the virtual world?
Okay. So I'm sort of still vaguely embarrassed to say I am active on Twitter. I am active on Twitter.
Active, you own Twitter, I would say.
Well, you know, as a historian who's public-minded, it's the most amazing way to reach a lot of people at a moment when people need to be thinking about history, precedent, the Constitution. So yeah, I'm on it a lot and often for those reasons. My handle, my Twitter handle, is JB as in boy, F as in Freeman, 1755, which is one of the possible years that Hamilton was born. So, okay, look at that. Yeah, you're good. So yes, there it is my, and so I invite you to follow me there. I also on Thursday mornings began during the sort of quarantine-ish moment, because everyone was at home, because parents were trying to teach, because we all were looking for things to do, and because of the historical significance of this moment and the ways in which I really believe the tools of understanding history are going to help us understand the present moment. I'm doing a weekly, I don't know what you call it, a series of conversations, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we talk about how we understand something in the past and how understanding that can help us understand the present. So for example, I've talked about women in resistance and how women, what kind of power they were able to take in the past and how that can help us understand some of what's happening today. I'm going to be talking about the power of images and portraits and what kind of an impact they can have politically that maybe other kinds of things don't necessarily have. Actually, it's not unrelated to the kinds of things we've been talking about here in this conversation. So anyway, it's about 45 minutes every Thursday morning, and it's, we start out by talking about history, and then I sort of pivot and talk about the present. I invite people to come along for that. And Yale filmed a number of their different lecture courses that were popular. My American Revolution lecture course was filmed. I think it's, I don't know, 26 lectures or something like that. They just stuck a camera in the back of the room and filmed it, but it's online for free. Anybody can watch it. I don't know, I suppose I know it's on iTunes U and it's all over the place. It's History 116. So if you searched for American Revolution, Freeman, History 116, and I should say the History Matters Thursday morning conversation can be found on Thursday mornings at, let's see if I get this right, nche.net/conversations. I feel so high tech. Anyway, I know it's scary. At any rate, those are all ways in which you can get at history at a moment when I just think it's so important for us to be thinking about this moment. I know I've spoken with both Scott and Paul before. I'm going to end my comments with this comment. It's so easy in this moment of so many things happening on so many levels to conclude, on the one hand, it's all going to be fine in the end, whatever, or to conclude, we're done, right?
Right.
And those are both irresponsible conclusions, because the fact of the matter is we don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And what that means, and what I'm trying to drive home on Thursday mornings, is that means we have to be alert, we have to think about what's happening, and we have to take action to push things in a direction that is for the good. And so I think, you know, part of why history matters in this moment, contingency matters. We have to understand that what's going on now is still happening, and it matters. What we say matters, what we do matters. And I will now step off my soapbox.
I'm such a fan. I could just sit, you know, and listen to you all day.
That is kind of you.
And there's Paul.
Hey,
there I am.
there you are.
That is my Twitter, and it's the same on Instagram. And
Say it out loud for your Twitter.
it's Tall Power Paul, at Tall Power Paul, and just search that, and you'll fall into the rabbit hole of the things I'm doing, which I will touch on quickly now. The biggest thing that's going on with me right now is, while doing Hamilton, I got it in my mind, I don't know how, that I would start creating short form content, short films. The first two that I made, much to my surprise, are now winning awards and laurels and film festivals all over the world. One is called Buffalo, and of course I shot it when we were on tour in Buffalo. And I'm gonna make it's briefly about isolation and loneliness and pushing through that to create. And so I got it in my head now with my co-conspirator that I'm going to make an anthology of these short films. And this is the one that's really winning a lot of awards, about the different ways that the Black man exists on Earth in different situations. So I will portray, you'll see me in each film, but I'll be portraying someone vastly different, because the other thing that sometimes happens with Black men in America is, oh, well, they're a monolith. No group of people is a monolith. So I'm really excited to keep pushing forward in that. And then my second project is a project called Columbus, and it's an Afrofuturism sci-fi thriller. And I cast a lot of the members of Hamilton. So it's a great kind of backstory, how we find a way to put this thing together. We never miss a show to do it. So we will do 2 shows Saturday, have a blocking rehearsal Saturday night, 2 shows Sunday, start shooting from Sunday at midnight till about 4 a.m. Wake up Monday, shoot from 3 p.m. to about 2 a.m. And if we have anything left to do, we shoot it Tuesday morning from 11 a.m. to 3, so we can take a break before we have to do the show Tuesday night.
Wow.
And everyone's on board, you know, it's really, I think the best thing about it is everyone is on board, and I'm really proud of this content. They're both still on the festival circuit, so I can't show them just yet. If you DM me and beg, I may see. I'll let you two see. So that's the main thing that's going on with me, other than, you know, I'm writing a lot of other stuff. I wrote for television for a while, in between the politics and the coming back to Hamilton. I just want to say, I can't say any better what Joanne said about contingency, how we are in this place of not knowing. But what I love that you said that I want to comment on is, and help me, because I think you said what's going on then is still going on now, or something to that effect. And I hadn't thought about that bridge. You know, I had thought about that happened then, and what, were we in a cave for 400 years and now it's happening now? Of course not, right? So everyone has grappled probably with this along the way, but I think history kind of like a bouncing ball, it'll hit and then it'll float and then it'll hit. And so there will be similarities. And I think we're in a very similar moment to the American Revolution. In a very similar moment. There are factions, you know, the Hesses over there and who's over here, and what are they thinking? Should we trust them and talk to them? Who says Black Lives Matter? Who doesn't? What are you actually doing? You know, posting on social media is not. Who's arguing? Who's backing off and saying, hey, peace, love, man? Like, nobody knows what's going to happen. And this huge election is coming up. So if I may plug whenweallvote.org, the thing that matters to me most as we talk about participating, and, you know, I also love what Joanne said about, it's not that we're judging if you know, the two extremes of, oh, we're doomed, all right, it'll be okay. No one's judging that, but I feel like if you want to have some agency in what happens in your life, one of the things you can do is vote. And there's a lot of people trying to stop you from doing that. Georgia is really in the news today. Right. Whenweallvote.org get registered. If you have questions about voting by mail or absentee ballots, you can get those questions answered. Or, hey, you know what? This is so important to me, reach out to me personally, and I will help you get the answers you need. So anyway, whenweallvote.org, go there, explore, get yourself ready to go. And let's see how this thing turns out. I'm excited to be in this moment in history.
There are transitional moments. I mean, all of history is a transition, but there are polarizing moments where people understand in the United States that a decision is being made that maybe is more apparent and widespread than some other decisions.
Absolutely.
And you could march your way through American history and talk about those moments. Those are moments when awareness matters. Those are moments when principles matter. Those are moments when you need to act and to defend your, in favor of your principles. And there are moments when the structure of politics matters, so that you vote to be able to have an influence, so that elections happen and are free and fair elections, that, all of these things are, you can, like I said, you can march through history and pinpoint them, but we're definitely in one of them now.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. The most important thing that people can do is to vote and to do all that they can to help the voting process and the electoral process wherever they are.
Be fair, right. Scott, I know you're going to wrap up, but I just want to say one more thing. We have to do this again because I'm so passionate about one of the things we were going to bring up about does executive power matter and how does it matter, and talking about George Washington in that light. And we will fall down a very deep rabbit hole if we start now. But just, with this idea of, well, if we get the Senate, then it doesn't matter. That chess game and how Washington was how they were all making it in that moment of how will we make this so that no one can have absolute power. And so how much does the presidency matter? There are so many people that say, get the Senate, because even if somehow he stumbles back into office, he won't be able to do any harm. So I just want to get into that, and how it relates to Washington deciding to step down and try and set that precedent. And
sounds like
that's another hour though.
We're going to have another conversation.
That's another hour. Yeah.
No, this is fabulous. It's moments like these when I like to cite our Philadelphian Benjamin Rush. And the quote, Joanne, in January of 1787, the American War is over, but this is not the case with the American Revolution. Ooh. Only the first act of the great drama is over. And, if there's one thing we hope people walk out of this museum understanding is that the American Revolution hopefully is never over. It's a process. It's not something that's done.
It might still be going. Like, that's what I was getting from what Joanne said about making this inference rather than that happened. And then everything was fine in the 50s and now this is happening. That's not right. Hearing her say like, no. Yeah. This is, or this maybe, or was it this? We've just come to something now that feels very like seismic again. Mm-hmm. A complete shift. Yeah, the revolution never really stopped. Right?
I'm hanging on that.
History doesn't start and stop.
It doesn't start and stop.
Whatever's happening now has deep roots. And so you have to study the roots and understand them to understand the present. And you're right, that it's not a stopping and starting process. It's ongoing, and change is ongoing. And that's why right now matters. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joanne Freeman, Paul Oakley Stovall, my dear friends, this has been fabulous, and I'm delighted that we're now committed to just having another conversation. We're going to just keep this rolling like a great graduate seminar.
Awesome.
So, this was great.
And we'll talk soon.
Thank you both. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.